Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today we're working on an LX charger, which I'm repairing the quarter panels that had a little bit of rot. Now what I did was I cut out the area that was actually rotted out, checked on the backside to see if there's any more rust. I took care of any other rust and made sure I sealed it all up, and this way that area can be protected. Then on the outside, I made sure I ground down the welds on the new patch panel on both sides, and now I applied the first layer of fiberglass filler, which I sanded down, and right now I'm adding a mixture of fiberglass filler and normal filler. Now, don't mix fillers that you know are not compatible. Right now, I'm using the same brand, and I've done this a long time, and it actually adds a little bit of fiberglass hairs into the normal filler. I'm using Evercoat, and this way you can get in there and actually have a stronger filler than normal filler with the fiberglass hairs in it. Now, the reason why I'm doing the filler work with the bumper still on is I want to make sure that that line is there, and I'm going to loosen the lower bumper, sand it down, and make sure that there's nothing in between the crack like I'm doing right here. I'm pulling it out, but I'm still going to loosen the bolts, sand it down underneath, make sure everything is nice and evenly applied with the paint so no rust forms. But like I said, this is so you can keep the line that you want, and then you can pull the panel off at the end, block both sides, prime it, put it back together, and put the color on. Now I also made my filler a little thinner, and that's why it's taking me a little while to get the spread out nice and evenly on this area while it's still on a vertical surface. Don't be too critical on yourself. You know, you're going to be sanding off almost 90% of this, and then you'll be able to get it nice and even. Check it with your guide coat and make sure you have a nice level surface for your primed area. Now, before it completely dries, you can only see if there's any filler in areas that you didn't need it, and that way you can take that off. I also use tape like you saw to make sure that the area that you don't want anything on is also taped off from getting any of the extra filler landing on it. Alright, both sides are now welded up, and I applied my filler like I showed you with the primer and everything, and now we're blocking and sanding them out. Alright, so if you're wondering how to take off your 2006 style spoiler, we're going to show you how. Now mine was with 4 screws, some will only have 2. There's going to be 2 on each side. Make sure you have a Phillips head, and you leave 1 on each side unless you have somebody to hold it for you, and then you can have them hold the spoiler as you take out all 4 screws so it doesn't slide down and scratch your car. Now the reason why I'm doing this is I'm going to be installing a brand new spoiler. I'm going to be going with a newer generation style spoiler, the Hellcat spoiler. Now, what I'm going to be doing is measuring and putting it on before I drill everything out, but I have to weld up the original holes, cut out some new metal, and be able to get it all in there. I have a few patches I have to do because this is a pursuit package, and I want to make sure I weld up those original holes where they routed those wires through for the lights. Now, what you just saw me do was remove the spoiler by lowering the lid just enough, and I went in there with my hand and left one of the screws or bolts in just enough with a few threads so that I could take it off by myself without any scratches to the rest of the car. As you can see here, here are the holes I had to get rid of, and there's also some holes where there was some filler cracking, where they must have just only used filler. So I'm going to grind those areas down, put in some metal. As you can see here, those are the original pursuit holes, and we're going to be welding those up in another video, which you can check out on my account. Alright, as we were waiting for the filler to dry on both quarter panel sides so that we can block it out and get it even flatter, we're going to move on, and like I said, this will be for another video. As you can see here, it's already dry, and we're going to get some 40 grit on the block sander. That way we can get the hardest stuff off first, and then move our way up to a 110, a 220, a 320, and then we're going to be able to put a primer on there, block it out again about one more time, spray another coat of primer, and then we'll be ready for paint. Now, the reason I put tape up again is it allows you to keep some of the area next, so if you accidentally are standing next to it and it goes past where you want to, it helps prevent scratches in the rest of the paint, and the finish is still good, but remember you still have to feather it out so you don't see the repair. Now you can go back and forth, keep a linear pattern, and then you're going to want to do like an X pattern. You do not want to keep sanding in the same direction for too long. That way you have a chance of preventing it from flattening in the wrong way and keeping it as level as possible. Remember, you can always put another coat on if you see something that's too low, and anything that's high, you can always hammer down or grind if it was a weld or something else like that, or if the metal's protruding, make sure you level it out with your hammer first, and then you can put on a nice skim coat if you actually dented the panel a little bit. And what I mean by dented, I'm not talking about a huge amount. I'm talking about like a millimeter from the hammer's edge, and you're just worried about that showing through. You're gonna make sure that you can get any of those small, we'll call it a ding out from the hammer if you leveled it as much as you can, because that's what the filler's for, is to help take up that little bit. You're not gonna be building up a whole inch or something like that. You don't want to be known as someone who uses filler instead of metal. You're just going to use the filler to help bring out the area that was uneven, if you have any, from the actual repair that's in the safe level of recommended filler. Now, if you're interested in learning about more of that, there's plenty of nice YouTubers out there that have very good informational videos about how much filler is actually recommended in your panel and how much hammer and metal work you have to do before you're using too much filler. And like I do, I always make sure I'm in that parameter and I can always block out and stay in that parameter. That way that area has a really good strong repair. Alright, at this point, I'm going to be switching over to the orbital sander to get any more of the excess off. As you can see here, I even shoved a piece of sandpaper in that center area. This will keep you from hitting down below, and this will also keep you from sanding too much off in the areas that you don't want to. As you see, I'm really using this tape liberally because one, it's so old and it's barely even usable for when we paint, so I use it just to protect the panel when I'm sanding with the orbital sander or anything else. And like I said, it really does save you some time when you're prepping the rest of the panel if you're using some heavy grit sandpaper to get off that excess filler that you applied. And since I use fiberglass in the filler mixture while I'm putting it on most of my cars, that way it actually is stronger and will hold up even longer, even if it's really thin and in the parameter. I have to use usually an orbital sander to help knock down that area and then go back with the block sander one or two more times before I apply the filler. Again, if I am doing a skim coat with flow glaze or something else like that. That way, if there's any pinholes left, I can get all that done too within the area that needs to be done. Now what you want to do is make sure the orbital sander kind of puts the pressure on there, not you, so you're not pressing in and making indentations on the panel, even though you're going to go over it with the block sander because orbital sanders will not get it completely flat unless you're really completely skilled with the orbital sander, and I don't doubt there's someone out there who can get it flat. But like I said, I like to rely on some guide coat and my block sander at the end once I'm done, and then I put my primer on, block it out one more time, look it over, prime again, and then if it is a show car, I'll probably do it one more time. But if it's just a standard car or a daily driver, I'll send it out at that point to put some base and clear on or put your single stage paint. Now, when I am done with the heavier grit sandpaper up to 110, then once I get to 220, I will pull off the tape so that the rest of the panel is safe from heavy gouging. And right now I'm still sanding in between that area, and then I'll be taking off that back bumper. But right now we're using it with the panels on so we can get that line nice and straight so that it matches and has a good gap. Alright, this is when I already block sanded out to 400 grit the other area on the dog leg, which did have new metal installed almost 6 years ago from me. I had a little dent right there, so I added a little filler after I hammered it out to make sure it's nice and smooth. Put it on that filler, sand it out, and then we applied just a small skim coat again. Now, while the skim coat is drying, I'm going to go on to sanding this bumper area, which is where there was a crack at one point from a tree falling on it. I did plastic repair on it, and now I'm applying the fiberglass filler over the top of it. Then we're going to mount the bumper again, check it out, see how the gapping looks. Then we're going to pull the bumper off again, prime it, and make sure everything's done. But right now I'm block sanding out that fiberglass filler by hand because this is a very heavily curved area So if you use an orbital sander, you can use the orbital sander, like I said, to knock off the heavy areas of filler if you applied it in an area that's a little thick. This way you can get it easier for you to block it out. But if you do use an orbital sander on a curved area, it will not let it get flat like it's supposed to, because it's not going to lay on the panel like how a block will. Now this is where good old-fashioned elbow grease comes in. It's going to take a little while, but if you use normal filler, it will not take as long to come off. At this point, I'm using Evercoat filler with a mixed in of their Evercoat fiberglass filler. All right, what we're gonna do now is wait for this area to dry, mount the bumper on, take a look at the angles and everything else like that, make sure the gaps are all good, block it out one more time, prime it, and put it back on and test fit it again. Now at this point I could film every little step, but it will be almost a 6-hour video, so I was cutting some of the material down. I block sanded the same area on the opposite side up to 600 grit, and this way I can be ready for my primer to go over that area again. As you can see here, I used a flat black sealer primer after self-etch, and it seemed close to the color of what the outside is. It's a flat black single stage, and remember, I am going to be sanding those areas, so the color difference doesn't matter yet because this is not the full paint job. Alright, you'll be seeing me install this engine brace inside my engine compartment on another video, so stay tuned for that. This is just a little teaser of you seeing what's going to come next. Now it's a little dusty as it's been inside for bodywork, so don't judge on the dust. Now the next area of repair is going to be the pillar where the spotlight was originally drilled through. Now the last owner, the people who decommissioned the police package, only used filler in this section, which caused it to crack. What we're going to do is use the orbital sander with 40 grit, and we're going to dig at it. I'm even have to pull out my drill with a uni bit or a drill bit to make sure I can get through all that extra filler, because we're going to be welding in new metal in that area to make sure those holes are filled up and won't crack again. Now I marked out the areas that we're going to be sanding down, because this is where the original spotlight is. It's going to have 3 holes, so we're going to make sure we sand down all that area to make sure we expose those holes so that we can actually put in the metal like I said, so it doesn't have this issue again in the future. Alright, so I did speed up the footage at this point so you can see how I'm pulling off the paint, but not at the standard rate. So it did take about 3 minutes to pull this off versus how fast you're seeing it now. What you're going to do is go through all the layers of paint, primer, and everything else like that. If there's any factory paint left underneath, depending on what they did in the area, there wasn't on this area because they did the repair after the factory paint was already sprayed. So what you're going to do is use that 40 grit. You can actually use a little bit of the edge of the orbital sander if you're afraid of hitting the other panels, because right now you're not actually blocking out and getting it flat. If you're trying to get it flat, I would say never use the edge of your orbital sander. It's going to ruin the orbital sander, and it's also not going to make the panel flat. Alright, we're finally at the point where we're exposing the hole outlines. As you can see here, there's 3 of them, which we're going to have to get the drill bit out at this point and get the rest of it out once I'm done exposing it. Alright, as you can see here, I got down to clean metal, and we can see the 3 holes where we're going to have to drill slash chisel out, because you're never going to get the sander in there. So what you're going to want to do is choose out a drill bit that's close to that size, a chisel or a screwdriver, and you're going to slowly chip away at that, because you're not going to want that filler to be in that cavity while you're welding up. You're going to want to remove it all so we can get new metal in there. As you can see here, I'm using my drill to go through. Do not drill all the way through the second layer of metal because this is a double layer area. You could twist the drill bit side to side to ream the hole a little bit more. It doesn't matter if it's oblong. What you're doing is trying to get out all that filler without damaging any of the metal. As most of you will not be dealing with the filler in your pillar because this was done aftermarket when the car was decommissioned from the last seller, which it held up about 7 years without cracking, but we're going to be putting in metal instead of just putting filler there. Alright, so at this point we got almost all the filler we could out of the actual area. Some of it you will not be able to remove if it's so embedded in there without ruining the metal itself. There's some highs and lows which are going to take care of that first before we weld in the new metal. So take your hammer to hammer out any of the highs and lows. We can pull some of the area towards you if it's a little too low. And once we sculpt the new metal in there, that's when we'll play around with the hammer a little bit more. Right now we just want to knock down most of the high areas like I was saying. So when we go to weld it, we don't have to worry about the welds building up even higher than the high areas. As you can see here, I'm still trying to chisel out some of that filler, which will also make the metal move around too, because the hole is a little bit too small for that screwdriver I was using. But we're going to play around with the hammer again, get it to lay down nice and flat, like I said, before we weld in the new metal on that area. At this point, I was using a Phillips head, so we actually had kind of like a tip to go into it versus just a flat edge. You can use whatever you want to try and get some of that filler out. The reason why I'm going so into it is because the filler will catch on fire, and I don't need that happening with the rest of the car on the inside still fully furnished. So we're going to try and prevent us from having that issue by removing all that filler that we could. Now I'm not using much pressure on the hammer. I'm kind of just guiding it to the surface and using the weight of the hammer itself to actually press the metal down and flatten it. It really doesn't need much manipulation before we get the patch in there. Now when you feel that all the high spots are gone, you can then cut out the patch that you need to fill in those holes. You can use a piece of blue tape so that we can get an accurate patch made out of metal. Now there's two ways you could do this. You could patch each individual hole. You could just weld up the holes or cut in new metal, which I'm going to cut in new metal and then weld them up. Now I'm using my Miller-Matic 215, which is a multi-function welder. I recommend getting your ground wire as close as you can to your patches that you're going to be welding in. I use a magnet to actually hold it onto the bare metal because I'm not going to be able to get the clamp down on the actual panel without grinding it down somewhere else. I also use my air from my compressor to cool off the metal as I'm doing the spot weld. That way you're pretty much stitching the new metal onto the old metal without warping anything. TIG also helps you have less of a chance of warping it, but I am using MIG wire right now, which I prefer to use MIG. It's a little easier for me right now because I don't have the TIG set up all the way that I want. But I do have a TIG system, so I'll be using that later on in some other of my other cars. Alright, what you're going to want to do is make sure you check the inside of your cabin. I do have a welding blanket on the inside, making sure nothing comes through that pillar and travels inside and starts a fire. Now what I do recommend is doing about 2 or 3 spot welds at a time, then using your air from your compressor to cool off the panel where it's almost cool to the touch. Go inside, look at the inside of the cabin of the vehicle that you're welding on. Make sure there's nothing going on, no extra smoke, nothing simmering or smoldering inside and causing something that can cause a fire when you're not paying attention. Now, if you don't have an air compressor, you can also use an ice pack. Just make sure it's not going to melt or anything like that because you don't want raw water on a bare metal surface. Now, this is something that you can take your time on. The more time you give your panel to cool off between each weld, the better, and you'll have less chance of warping that thin sheet metal that we use to build most of the cars nowadays. Alright, it took me about 40 minutes to finish that patch because I was taking my time and using the air compressor, making sure none of the panel was warping. Now you can do it in a faster, timelier manner if you're working on a budget or a time frame at a body shop or something else like that. That's a different story where you're on an insurance crunch time. For me right now, this is my own personal vehicle. The more time I take on it, the better. So make sure we can get it as good as I can get before I put it back into the paint booth per se, spray it with its last coat, and finish it up. Now I can take off the welding blankets and we can actually take a look at what my welded surface looks like, grind down the welds and anything else like that, add on some fiberglass filler after priming it, and then move on forward. Alright, as you can see here, I welded in my patch, and this way you can see that there's no burn on the paint anywhere else past there because I took my time and I made sure that the heat didn't transfer and burn any of that paint off because the rest of the area had some really good body work. I got it nice and straight, so we wanted to make sure we could contain that welded area as much as we could. Now, as you can see here, I'm wearing some full face gear. That way I don't get any of the stuff in my eyes. You want to make sure you don't damage your eyes. Wear a nice respirator to make sure none of those particles from grinding off that metal gets in your lungs. Now, grinding also has a chance of warping the metal, so make sure you don't sit there and grind in the same area for too long, especially if you're trying to flatten down the metal. I do recommend using your welding blankets to cover anything so the sparks don't have a chance of damaging the paint or ruining your windows or anything else like that. So cover anything that you do not want to get ruined or have a chance of getting burned. And make sure that your flap disc is about 40 grit or so, somewhere around there, so when you're actually grinding on the surface, it's cutting instead of polishing it. Anything that's aggressive on the cut is what's going to be needed at this moment because you're going to be shaping that metal and erasing all of those welds. Any sort of high spots, you're going to want to make sure you can grind it off fast, and then that way when you go to do your primer and body work at the end with the filler, you'll be able to lay it all nice and flat. Now, I recommend using some ear protection. I did put on my headphones with my music on. That way I can block out the sound of the grinder. You don't want to have your ears damaged by noises just like this. Now, just like what you're doing when you're welding with your MIG welder or TIG, you can use your air compressor on that area that you're grinding down flat to cut down some of the heat and dissipate it. Now, just like the welding, if you can take your time on this, like I was saying, the more time you take, less chance you have of warping the metal. Now, grinding down the panel might take just as much time as you did with welding it if you're going to make sure, like I said, to dissipate that heat. Don't forget to wear gloves and eye protection when you're doing this grinding, of course, and your respirator. Alright, once you're satisfied with grinding down your new patch and weld area to make sure it's nice and flush and ready to go, we're going to use some navel jelly or some rust gel on that area that we did the welding after we clean it up with a wire brush, obviously, or anything else like that. Some acetone. Set that gel on there like we're doing right now, and then we're going to apply our fiberglass filler and primer after it's done. Let it sit for about 15 to 30 minutes. Clean off the area with some acetone, and then we're going to be putting on our filler and primer. Now, this is the brand I use. It's Rust-Oleum. It's alright. I like it better than most out there, but it's not the strongest naval. Now, I use some steel epoxy on this area. I'm going to sand it down, and then I'm going to do my fiberglass filler and make sure I shape it, but this is going to allow it to have less chance of cracking over time, even though I know it wasn't going to crack because I put in actual metal. First, it's just a filler, which I didn't do that. Now the next step is going to be actually sanding it, like I said, with 40 and 60 grit, prepping it, and then putting on some primer and our new filler, which is going to be fiberglass based. Unfortunately, at this point, my GoPro and my phone was full of storage, so I did not get to get the video footage of me sanding down the fiberglass filler. This was 2 coats of getting it completely flattened down. Then we're going to do a 3rd coat to make sure all the pinholes are filled, and then sand it down again, block sand it all the way up to 400 grit. Then we're going to get on some primer and the first coat of base slash single stage, since this is a flat black single stage. Then we'll sand it down, and then we'll get ready for the full paint job once it's all done. As you can see here, this is when it was sanded up with 400 grit, and then we're going to be priming it, and we did a little bit of primer work, which you're going to see in a second. I started prepping the bumper while that area was drying. And then the back tail area, I started to do the same, applying my fiberglass filler and sanding it down, getting that area nice and sanded down flat. You can see that in my playlist of how to fix LX chargers and everything else like that. So go into my account. Remember to like and subscribe. Also check out some of our merch for sale on our eBay channel. You might find a part that you need. Thanks again, guys, and I appreciate you guys following through to the end. If you want to see some more videos, remember to chime in next week to see some more.